Welcome, everyone, to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. This week, we're happy to have back our regular guest, Kveldoffer Gunderson. And this week, he's going to talk about traditional forms of heathen and Germanic ritual, and then give us some ideas on how we can translate those into for the modern day.
Okay, well, one of the interesting things about Germanic ritual is that as we go down through the Well of Weird, or perhaps more come up from the Well of Weird, from the Stone Age onward, we can see the evolution of various elements of ritual and the addition of various elements of ritual. Because one thing that stands out when standing back and taking the very, very long view of the whole process is that the main elements don't ever seem to have been dumped, at least not once we get past the shamanism of the hunter-gatherer age and the transition from shamanism to agriculturalist organized religion, if you like. Have these very consistent themes. In the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, we're pretty much dependent on archaeological finds, which means that there's obviously going to be a lot we don't know, we'll never know. We cannot, for instance, really trace the continuity of any given god. We can't really trace any of them back to a definite origin point because the names aren't recorded. We see some images that are maintained, are preserved as holy images pretty much all the way through in a reasonably consistent use, but there's no way to say for certain that whoever was being honored, called upon, whoever's light was being used amuletically in the Stone Age with the little double-headed axe heads of flint or amber, was this the same god that we see with the axe in the Bronze Age rock carving, and was this the god that in the Viking Age we knew as Thor with his hammer, that the Sami knew it as Horagallus with his axe in one hand and his hammer in the other. We can be reasonably certain that red-bearded Perkunas with his hammer was left along the Baltic Trail by the Goths. The name Perkunas is cognate to the Gothic Fjörgyn, and we have the attributes of the god. We have a name that is associated with the Gothic name, which seems to describe a Gothic Thor, possibly, although we really don't know much about the Goths, but that's best guess. So there we can trace a certain amount of continuity, but from the earlier periods, it's very difficult. Now, one thing we do know about copiously from the archaeological remnants is what they were doing at their major feasts and rituals. We know how they were making offerings to the gods. And in the Stone Age, in the farming Stone Age, I think we're reasonably safe assuming that in the hunter-gatherer Stone Age, that they were probably doing some form of shamanic magico-religious practice. But once we get into more standard religion, we see holy sites are identified. Sometimes they are identified we find post holes suggesting there was a structure. We find either natural or constructed stone center places. And we know that they were going there and having big, massive feasts because we find the remnants of the big, massive feast, plus the rather nice crockery, which when the feast was over, they took and smashed, giving it to the gods, making sure it wouldn't be used for non-holy purposes. We don't know exactly what was in their minds, but we know they were doing this. We also know that they were already, even in the Stone Age, very big on sinking offerings in bogs and such, burying them as offerings. In the National Museum in Denmark, there are these magnificent, huge amber necklaces, and I am talking fist-sized chunks of raw amber here, and so long that a woman Like Melodi, my wife, could probably have looped it 3 times around and still had it dragging on the ground. Far too large for any human being to wear. Almost certainly gifts to the gods, or I suspect in my heart, can't prove a thing, that possibly offerings to a proto-Nerthus, to a goddess perhaps of fruitfulness and blessing associated with the bog, like the Nerthus we find described later. So that is the Stone Age. We also find a lot of ritual elements in the burial customs, which again stay very consistent throughout time. The dead are very carefully buried with the goods that they're going to need. I believe we had already started putting wild apples in the graves, and this continued through to the Viking Age. I think the apple is the symbol of ongoing life, life that is ever renewed, was already solidly in place very, very early on. Now does this mean that they knew Heathen? Well, that would be a very, very rash thing to say, since we actually don't have any proof even that she was worshipped in the Viking Age. No place names, no mentions of her outside of the stories of the gods. But as with most of our lesser known deities, and by lesser known I mean not the big three, Odin, Thor, and Freyr, that's a category that could actually, in terms of what we have surviving about the worship, encompass Frigg. But as with nearly all the goddesses, most of the gods who were not the big three, the absence of evidence is so not evidence of absence. Remember that a lot of the sagas where we have the written descriptions of worship were written down quite a while after the conversion, 200 to 400 years, by people who were very much romanticists, among other things, and therefore I think probably tended to focus on the big three that everyone knew about, more than they did on the wider pantheon that was probably actually being worshipped to various degrees depending on one's locality, nationality, family traditions, and so forth. But anyway, back to the topic of what was going on in the Bronze Age, or in the Stone Age. Again, from the earliest period onward, we get hunters such as Mother Sweden, the oldest body found in Sweden, who was certainly female. She'd had a whole pack of kids, unmistakable changes to the pelvic bones there. But she was originally identified as a male because she was buried with hunter's tools. She was obviously a very impressive hunter. And then somebody took a closer look at the pelvic bones and said, hey, this guy seems to have had like 14 or 15 kids. But we've got genetic testing now, so a lot of things are changing very quickly in our view of gender roles. In any case, one of the earliest customs in this hunting Stone Age, which did not seem to make it further on, but which is worth knowing about for anyone who takes a very wide, pan-temporal Germanic view of the religion, is that red ochre was terribly important. And we find, for instance, the burials at Scatterholm with a guy who is buried with his hunting gear and his hunting hounds, which are identical to the modern Norwegian elk hound, which also has not changed pretty much in the least for 9,000 years. And the grave was very heavily sprinkled with red ochre. The body was sprinkled with red ochre, as were a number of other bodies at the time. Now, it's probably a good guess that it was the visual similarity to blood, this very thing that is very strong in the Germanic, where the color red, the color of blood, is very strongly associated with magical power, with spiritual power in general. In fact, the German word for magic probably stems from the red word originally. Sauber stems from the red word. The idea is you make something magical by making it red. And this is, again, something that shows up very, very strongly in both the Viking Age and the Anglo-Saxon charms and healing spells, even though the use of red ochre had gone out of fashion some millennia before. But the concept endured. So as we moved into the Bronze Age...
Wait, I have one comment to make, very short, on the Stone Age, and that is that the earliest pottery so far found in the world is in Czechoslovakia. It's 28,000 years old, more or less, and it was made of miniatures of animals and then deliberately smashed, apparently ritually. So I find it very interesting that this ritual smashing of things is still going on in another part of Europe, like 20,000 years later. Yes.
Now, in the Stone Age, you did see a number of ritual miniatures of animals, but they tended to stay intact. In fact, some of them have stayed intact to the modern day. Amber was favored. Bone was favored. There's an interesting comb from Sweden, which has a man's head at one end and an elk's head at the other. And, maybe it's just decoration. Maybe there's a tale that we don't know about a hero born from an elk. Maybe someone was trying to say that someone he knew was an elk's butt, for all I know. Archaeology is difficult to figure out what they were thinking at the time.
But I think that makes a good point, though. It isn't always easy to tell what's a ritual object and what's a daily object.
Yeah, but again, back to what you were saying, the idea of ritual destruction to send things in the other world is another one that lasts all the way through the Viking Age very, very, very consistently. And we see it really reaching its flower in the late Roman Iron Age, early Migration Age, with finds like the Illerup find, which is this massive bog offering of a defeated army. The Hjort Spring find, which is another excellent example of they just sacrificed everything, smashed it, and threw it into the bog or the lake for the gods. So that is kind of where a lot of the fundamentals of our ritual practice started. Now, when we move into the Bronze Age, one of the things that's happening socially in the Bronze Age is people are getting together in much larger groups. We're seeing the shift, at least from clan chief, clan head, tribal chief, probably to much more powerful local chieftains, because we're getting bronze and gold up the south. We're sending them amber back. We're doing a lot of trading with the south. There was in fact, a permanent trading post in southern Sweden, which is being debated whether it was Mycenaean or Achaean, but it was certainly Greek and it was certainly permanent. So we're also seeing a lot more development in ritual, probably both in terms of size. I think we're probably would have been seeing much larger gatherings, but also in terms of elaborateness. And we can tell this because they very kindly left pictures for us. These rock carvings, which are all over Scandinavia, a lot of them are clearly showing ritual processions. We have guys marching around with lure horns, which are these sort of proto-sousaphone-like bronze horns. We have people in masks. We have animals. We have apparently supernatural beings. Perspective is always a bit dicey in early ritual art. But one of the most common themes on these is what is known for convenience as the spring marriage, where there's a man and a woman who are obviously in the process of getting married or something right next door to getting married. And there's a huge guy with an axe in a condition which polite archaeologists call epiphallic, standing right by them. Now, what we don't know is this Something similar to the marriage of Freyr and Gerther is the guy, the hostile brother that Freyr eventually has to kill because he just won't get with the program. Or any other, is it Odin and Gunnlod with Suttung standing by being ominous? Or is the guy with the axe the early equivalent of a priest of Thor with the hammer hallowing the wedding? Either is entirely possible, and we really have no way of knowing which is the case. But what we can be pretty certain of is that in the Bronze Age, they were doing elaborate processions. We know that they were including major ritual vehicles because we have that amazing sun wagon from Denmark, this huge, elaborate gilded bronze disc in a wagon drawn by bronze horses. We have these little sort of tableaus of ritual processions, which show the women in string skirts doing some sort of ritual acrobatic belly dancing thingy. We have a woman who is leading a snake on a leash, and this image shows up engraved on a couple of razors, which appear to show the sun's transition across the sky and under the earth. We have the guys in those sort of horned helmet-like things with their axes, and there seems to be a pair of twins that goes with the woman with the snake. We don't know if they were doing full-out ritual dramas, but I would bet just about anything that they were, because the ritual drama theme is something that we see later on as we get more information. Among all the branches of the Germanic family about whom anything is known. We don't know much about the Goths, so we can't really talk about them. So in the Bronze Age, then, we have moved on from the communal feast, possibly by itself. Again, we don't really know what they were doing, but if they were doing elaborate processions at the time, they didn't record it. So we have apparently moved on from the Bronze Age big communal meals with the god to the addition of a much higher or at least more elaborate level of rituals with the music, the mass, the processions, probably the scripts, or at least general scripts. And that is something that continues very, very strongly onward. Moving from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, we have a lot more contact with the rest of the world, and suddenly we're seeing a lot more ritual associated with war. And I mentioned the Hirt Spring and Illerup finds as two of our more spectacular examples of this. There's also an interesting selection of bones from North Germany, and some people have questioned whether these are real or whether they're forgeries. I'm not sure that there has been a final decision made, but if they are real, and if they're forgeries, they're very, very good forgeries, they're very plausible. They are a series of bones, both horse and ox, with inscriptions involving a Roman warship, involving battle. There's a picture of a Roman warship on one of them, and on the bones there is also a picture of an offering of the critter to whom the bone belonged. So were these bones part of a magico-spiritual ritual involving the offering of these animals and the use of their bones afterwards as a focus to drive out or defeat the threatening Roman forces? We don't know, but it seems, assuming that they are real, it seems like the most plausible explanation. Now, the offering of animals, again, this is probably one of the older and more consistent elements. It probably got started just about as soon as we started animal husbandry, when in fact, suddenly you have animals that are there, available when you want them, as opposed to maybe I'll get a deer for the feast and maybe I won't. And animals that you're going to have to slaughter at regular times throughout the year anyway to eat, because that's what you were raising them for in the first place. Now, by the time we get to the Viking Age, this is just as crucial as ever. In fact, in the Viking Age, the animal offering seems to be the number one central ritual activity of the northern heathens. And in fact, during the conversion, we have a couple of instances where annoyed gods or spirits show up because somebody either has just converted to Christianity or is about to convert, and they're not going to get their offerings anymore, and they're pissed off about it. The best known of these tales is the story of Thidrandi, where the household Disir come and take him because, well, they're about not to get offerings anymore and they're not happy about it. There's another saga in which an Icelandic farmer who's been a friend of Thor all his life, made his offerings, got it on well, he decides to convert. And Thor is really not too thrilled about this, but, okay, that he's a free man, he's got a right to worship. But on the other hand, he had this arrangement with Thor where he was giving him offerings and receiving the benefits. And Thor basically says, okay, you're breaking your fellowship, and I'm due a geld for this. And Thor offers him the chance to throw some silver into a nearby lake for him to pay off the geld. And of course, the guy isn't having any of it. He's a Christian now. And Thor decides to take his own offerings, some of the best animals out of the flock die, and the guy goes, touched by a pagan god, can't even eat them. And Thor appears to him in a dream and gives him a smack across the cheek that leaves a mark thereafter, because that's what you get for messing over a god. Actually, Thor was when you consider some of the things that other deities tend to do in similar circumstances, Thor was actually being very mellow to the guy. But the animal offering thing is one that's probably raised the most noise off and on over the years, mainly because we're not an agricultural society anymore by and large. A lot of people aren't used to the idea that, to get meat to eat, you've got to actually kill a critter. This sort of gut feeling that meat is what appears in packages on the supermarket shelves. I have heard allegedly Alsatru people say all sorts of rotten things about our ancestors and their way of practice in this field. And, my feeling is that even if you're not in a position where you can do animal offerings yourself, dissing the ancestors is not on. It's totally not on. And you can't say, ooh, I love their spirit. Ooh, I am a Viking. Oh, this is atavistic and horrible. Animal sacrifices are a sign of a primitive religion. We're not that primitive anymore. Like, nobody. Animal offerings are a sign of a religion where people know where their food comes from. And curiously enough, the main time when animal offerings were made was in the late autumn, where if you lived in Scandinavia, you were going to have to take your critters in over the winter, feed them on stored hay, and you had to choose very carefully which critters were worth the trouble and likeliest to make it through the winter, and the rest of them you had to knock on the head, chop up, smoke, make into sausages, whatever, so the humans could make it through the winter too. And this was a very not only a crucial but a potentially scary time of year if you were in an agricultural community entirely dependent on what you had stored and what you could kill and salt away for the winter. This was a time when more than any other time, you wanted to be in right with the gods. You wanted their blessing that the winter shouldn't be too hard or too long and run out your supplies. So it was a very happy combination of the practical, the necessary in the Middle-garth, in the earthly realm, and what you really, really wanted and had on your mind in terms of spiritual, of otherworldly influence. Of course, we're not, most of us, living on farms. Most of us don't slaughter our own livestock. Many of us live in little apartments in the city where the landlord would, get a little bit shirty if you brought a pig in and cut its throat there in your little tiny living room. It's messy. It's a messy process. Even if it's something as small as a duck, it's really messy. So that leads us to the question of what do we do? And unfortunately, the one piece of data which would give us the best clue, which is missing from the record. What did your average craftsman, your leather worker or smith or bone carver or whatever in York, what did he do or she do? A lot of craftspeople were actually female. But what did that person and their family do when it came winter nights time and, they were not raising their own critters. They were living in a city. There was not a convenient place to get 2 or 3 of your buddies together and go out back and knock a pig on the head. We don't know. It's possible that, groups of friends could have clubbed together, bought a critter, found a convenient place together, and done their ritual, divided up the meat for everyone to take home. In York at that time, it's not likely that there were sort of massive public rituals, as you might expect in cities without a overwhelming Christian presence. If you were in one of the large cities in Scandinavia at the time, say you were in Trondheim, and you were living in the equivalent of a little apartment or a hut or whatever in Trondheim, again, making your living as a crafter, you'd probably go to the big Hof of Freyr that was there. You'd probably go to one of the big religious centers that was right by or just outside the city for the main rituals, and whether these were performed by professionals or not, again, we don't know, but there's reasonable odds to think that where you had the really big hofs with ongoing responsibilities like the herd of horses at Trondheim, that you probably had a few people who were the main caretakers, arranging the big gatherings, what have you. So one option then is simply a bunch of people getting together, going outside the city limits, making their offerings. But again, that's not as easy to do these days as it sounds as though it might be. Trust me on this. It's not that easy. You have to actually have members of your group who are skilled in handling animals of whatever size you're ambitious enough to offer. You have to have people who are reasonably skilled in butchering, and that doesn't just mean knocking the animal on the head and cutting the throat, or just cutting the throat depending on the size of the animal, or using a humane stun gun, if they are, which there's considerable doubt about. You also have to know how to keep the meat as sanitary as possible, how to cut it upright.
So basically what you're talking about, though, is kind of sacred slaughtering.
Yes.
Yeah, I find that a lot of people that react kind of viscerally because of our culture to the terms animal sacrifice, if you call it sacred slaughter, because most of the time, I gather not always, but most of the time, the meat's going to be consumed by people. as well as having a portion offered to the gods.
Yeah, almost inevitably. We were not real big on wasting any part of the meat. The Greeks, they lived in a warm, comfy environment. They were not nearly as worried about making it through the winter every winter as we were. They could afford to do things like burn all that good fat and marrow bones and what have you. We couldn't. We couldn't afford to do that. It was a big deal just sprinkling the blood around. That was a, sacrifice in the modern sense of giving up something, because what the Icelanders at least mainly liked to do with blood was make blood sausages out of it. They're very good. It's very nutritious. It's a great way to keep nutrition from the animal through the winter. Now often there. Slaughter wasn't just at winter nights or the big feasts. Often people would make an animal offering at intermediate times when there was a need for it. You get descriptions in the sagas again of offerings before battle, which most of the time were animals, except when they weren't. But that's another issue, which I'll get to.
Right.
You have in Vigga Glum's saga. A fellow who's on the outs with Vigga Glumr, who comes from a very Odinic family and acts like it. This guy takes an ox and goes to a holy place of Freyr's and offers him the ox and explains that Vigga Glumr has basically screwed him over and could Freyr help. And the ox gives a bellow and drops down dead, which is a pretty good sign that Freyr's accepted the offering, and indeed, things are sorted out so that Vigga Glumr is not too long thereafter booted out of Iceland.
Mm-hmm.
What the guy did with the body is not recorded, but I think it's a fairly safe guess under the circumstances that he got his buddies together and they dragged it home and butchered it up and ate it.
Yeah. Because one of the other things that, from a modern perspective, I've noticed that a lot of people don't realize, because we just don't live on farms anymore for the most part, is what I call the barnyard problem, which you want to talk about that, the problem of extra male animals.
Yeah, which you're always going to get. If you have a herd of dairy cows, that's great, but only the females and the occasional stud bulls are worth anything. The steers, unless you have a need for oxen to draw your plow, in which case, you castrate them and you train them to the plow, and that's grand. But still, you have a limited need for neuter males on your dairy farm. You have a real limited need for fertile males, especially since they are large, aggressive, and dangerous, which the Norse were very well aware of. So what do you do with the rest of them? Well, if you're in an agricultural society, there's only one obvious answer, which is you eat them. And you have to eat them, because otherwise you're going to be overrun, feeding a lot of useless animals, while the animals you really need for survival are not getting enough food.
Not only that, but in a lot of cases, males fight.
Males fight, and male cattle, let me not stress, I cannot stress this too heavily, male cattle are dangerous.
Yeah. Whereas you do see males being kept, and interestingly enough, actually, that makes me wonder, what about sheep? Because male sheep, actually, that are castrated are actually more valuable.
Yeah, sheep are valuable. And sheep were used as offerings often enough. Again, particularly in Iceland, but the sheep word may actually come from a root meaning to seethe, which was an important method of preparing the ritual meal. There is obviously a fairly significant spiritual place for sheep in ritual and worship, and unfortunately we don't know a lot about it because it's not one of the animals associated with the deities about whom the most got written. There's a vague suggestion that Heimdallr may in some way be associated with the ram, and it's a pretty vague suggestion, and there's only one of it, so, you can't take it too far. But after that, all we can say is, well, yeah, it's there. But when animal offerings are mentioned in the sagas, most of the time they're talking about either cattle or pigs, And again, archaeologically, there was a recent dig in Norway where they had dug up a huge number of swine bones around the smithy. They had been put in or around the smithy, and one wonders, was this in some way a reference to the forging of Guttenbergsty of Freresborg? Well, we don't know, but obviously they were definitely doing something because they went to some trouble to do this.
You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages. Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melodi, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melodi with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodireader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today? We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future.
That still leaves us, that's all, with the question, well, that's all really nice, and we're glad they were able to slaughter their own swine and put the bones under the smithy or wherever else the bones needed to go. But how does this help our guy in his city apartment today? If you don't have a group of buddies, including experienced critter handlers and butchers, what do you do? Well, there have been a couple of suggestions that have been experimented with, practiced, what have you, over the last few years, last 20 or 30 years, in fact. This simplest version is the one where you just do your blessing of the animal and the gods, and by extension the other animals who have died to feed you throughout the year. Right there on the table when you're holding the ritual, and you bring out the big old haunch of ham or beef or whatever it is that you're eating, and you basically bless it and offer it and pass it around and share the feast with your friends and family and the gods, just as if you had whacked it yourself. The other very popular choice is making critters out of bread, or even bread with a bit of meat baked in, and bringing them out, ritually hallowing them, blessing them, taking a ritual sax or what have you, and chopping the head off, and pouring a holy liquid of some sort into the bowl where the blood would have gone, and proceeding from there to sprinkle it and pour it, and all the things that you would have done if that had been a live critter and that were real blood. It's my personal experience that all of these are satisfactory, certainly from a ritual sense or one of personal spiritual perception, and to the best of my knowledge to the gods as well, because you are doing your absolute best under the circumstances you have. You have not forgotten to honor your ancestors and their practices, as contrasted to, say, calling them atavistic or primitive, which is not cool. You have shown your honor for the animals, which themselves are in a way manifestations of their gods, of the relevant gods. One of the things it's important to keep in mind about the Germanic view of the other critters in this world is that the gods were very closely associated with specific animals, and therefore, as best we can tell, it was understood that there might perhaps even some of their awareness was manifest through these animals. And the best known examples are going to horses for omens, as was done in Tacitus's Germania, and may well have been done at places like Trondheim, where you had the herd of horses that were hallowed to Freyr. We certainly have a number of examples of live animals that were associated with hoofs. Horses most commonly, but there's a few references to cattle with gilded horns and the like. And that in turn brings us to another possibility for the modern Alcitrue person who's not in a position to make their own animal offerings, assuming that you're in an apartment that will at least let you have pets, snakes, fish, whatever. And that is hallowing an animal specifically to a deity as a sort of living offering that you treat carefully, tend lovingly, because you're, as well as taking care of the animal itself, you're also worshiping the deity through it. And this is, I think, very popular with everyone who accepts that Snorri is telling the truth about Freya being associated with cats. Unfortunately, we don't have any other references for that, so we don't know if Snorri's telling the truth about it or not. It's the one critter association in the description of Baldur's funeral that he doesn't actually quote from the original poem to back his statement up. All the rest of them are mentioned in the original poem. So, this may have been something that just he was getting writer's cramp. He didn't feel like noting it down, since we know the poem from the bit Snorri quoted. But maybe it wasn't in the poem, but it was something he'd heard elsewhere. It was, general knowledge. It was in the water. He didn't feel any need to comment about it any further than saying, yeah, this is Freya's wagon drawn by cats, and she's called owner of the Fress, which is a word that can mean tomcat, or possibly it means bear, or it could be referring to pine martens or something. Although, having dragged you along this far, I will say one thing we do see in the grave goods in the Viking Age is first cats start being buried predominantly with women, actually in the Migration Age. And the Migration Age cats are your basic Egypto-Roman, Romano-British small, lithe, short-haired tabbies. And then in the Viking Age, we started going east to get a better grade of cat, which became the magnificent Norwegian forest cat. But in the burials, there's a very clear distinction between the fact that men, when they're buried with animal skins, are mostly buried with bear skins. Women are buried with lynx skins. And this is pretty common, particularly, I think, in kind of eastern Sweden, Birka-ish area. And you see that, and you see the various cat carvings and cat-like critters on the Oseberg Wain, and, the wonderful little amber cat figurine from Birka. And you start thinking, okay, at least the archaeological evidence, the iconographical evidence, doesn't contradict it, and certainly suggests very strongly, whether you specify a goddess or not, that cats were at least to a more associated with women than with men. Though curiously enough, the cat word is masculine, and it appears as a male by name once, and there's also in the flighting in one of the Helgi poems, the phrase shameless as a cat is used, shameless as a cat's son, actually, which tells us perhaps mainly that the Norse were observant, as anyone who's ever had breeding cats will be well aware. Well,
traditionally in farm life too, cats tend to fall into the realm of more of what women do. They're also out there helping keep the grain and stuff that the
Yeah,
men
and
will be aware of. But there are
yeah,
a lot in the kitchen.
in the kitchen and also in the Viking Age, women were the supply officers for the house. Women were responsible for making sure the food got in, got properly processed, got properly stored, and basically everything that cats are good for would have been falling into the province of assisting the woman of the house with this crucial duty of making sure that once the menfolk had done the heaviest labor, wrestling the large animals, got the animal down and dead. After that, it's her problem. She is totally responsible for the family economy.
Well, another really
Yes.
quick, interesting archaeological tidbit is, again, 9,000 years ago, they find the first burial of a cat in Malta. Maybe probably think it's the oldest known burial of a cat. It's a large cat buried with a woman, and it's with the first farmers.
Yeah, the two they tend to go together. But anyway, so that is animal offerings and our best suggestions for what we can do, since we are not in fact generally not in fact in the same agricultural situation as our ancestors, and it's time to move on to a bit more of the characteristically Viking Age elements of ritual. Now, the most notable of these, certainly the one that's had the most written about it, is probably the ritual drama. Now, they could very well, and I think probably were doing this as early as the Bronze Age. I think this is a continuous thing more than a new development. But I think that there is sufficient evidence to say that it reached a particular prominence in the Viking Age. About 80 to 100 years ago, there was a notable Norse scholar by the name of Dame Bertha Philpotts. Dame Bertha, in fact, was the headmistress of Girton's College, which later merged with Cambridge and was, in fact, my college at Cambridge. But that's another story. Anyway, she wrote this fascinating monograph looking at the structure of the poems of the Elder Eddas, and suggesting that they were actually meant to be scripts for ritual dramas. And when you look at them, they read just like scripts. You have dialogue interspersed with little prose bits of stage directions, and that's what you have. That's what the Eddic poems pretty much consist of. And we know that there was a lot of masking going on. Again, we see visual records of processions, the Osberg Tapestry being the most notable. We have various interesting little pieces of jewelry. There is a series of brooches from the Hedeby upland area, which show a woman walking a horse being met by another woman who is carrying a cup or horn or vessel of some sort, a shield, and is wearing a raven mask. And I suspect very strongly that these brooches are showing a bit of funerary ritual of the wife or mother walking the deceased man's horse to be met by in this case, very probably actually a Valkyrie. Because the Valkyries are very strongly associated with ravens, and that's what they do. They collect dead people. They collect the dead. They welcome them into the one little specific bit of the other world where the Valkyries are the women who are responsible for carrying out the welcome. In the other halls of the gods, other goddesses or beings do it. It's a common female thing. One certainly ought to think that every woman who is waiting with a cup to present as a Valkyrie, that would be an incredibly, awesomely bad mistake. And let me just say, that some people have the hair-raising, terrifying practice of referring to the woman who carries the horn around at general symbols as a Valkyrie, which is only appropriate if you're a bunch of people about to go out into mortal combat and expect to die. If you would actually like to, live, don't be accepting drinks from Valkyries.
What would
How simple is that?
What would you suggest calling that particular position instead?
Fraue, Athling woman, Lady of the Hall, any appropriate term for a noblewoman. Dies is fine. The Dies word can apply equally to a human noblewoman or human woman of power as it can to a goddess or to the ancestral, more or less collective that we call the Dies here. So calling her the Hall Dies would be fine.
Actually, I kind of like that. I think if you're doing stage directions, and we can get into that in a little while, but calling her the Hall Dies.
Yeah, and that gives the nice kind of option of overlap between this world and the supernatural, because it's appropriate for every woman. It's even appropriate for noble Eton women, like Grendel's mum. She's called a Dies, or the Anglo-Saxon cognate. Admittedly, possibly sarcastically. Hard to tell.
They had interesting senses of humor.
Yeah, but the point is, it's a very fine generic, as opposed to Valkyrie, which is very specific and means you're about to die.
Thank you.
Where were we?
I was going to say, so I think we were sort of edging into
ritual dramas.
Yeah.
Okay, back the Epic poems, ritual dramas. So there is a lot of evidence, and there's a fellow called Terry Gunnell who in the 1990s wrote a really excellent book on the origins of drama in pre-Christian Scandinavia, in which he basically takes Dame Philpott's theory and runs massively with it. And one of the things that really stands out is that the idea of ritual masking, ritual drama-like abilities, whether they're as relatively simple as the Varangians dressing up in bear and wolf skins and running around at Yule time in Constantinople, very probably associated in some way to the Berserk thing and the worship of Odin. Or whether it's a full-out memorize the script and do the performance. It is incredibly pervasive. And if you look at the epic poems and read them thinking of drama, they're splendid dramas. And they work on all sorts of levels. For instance, if you look at Thrymskvida, which is the well-known poem in which Thor's hammer has been stolen, Thor goes to Loki for help, Loki locates the hammer in the hands of the giant Thrymr, and Heimdallr comes up with this idea that Thrymr's demanding Freya as the ransom, and Heimdallr comes up with this idea that Thor should dress in drag and pretend to be Freya, proving that Heimdallr has more of a sense of humor than he's often given credit for, among other things, I suspect. But, so Thor dresses up in the veil, and then there's all this very funny byplay about, why did Freya just eat 7 salmon and 7 whole oxen, and, oh, she hasn't eaten for 9 nights, she was so hot for you, Loki running interference. And it's played by the right people. It was probably gut-bustingly funny. Admittedly on the level of, crap American talent shows where the football players dress up as cheerleaders, okay, because you would have your village and you'd probably get the biggest, burliest, beardiest guy in your village you could find to play Thor with the veil, and it would be very, very funny to watch. At the same time, you can also look at it and probably, very few, relatively few people who were primarily magically or spiritually inclined, they would have looked at it and probably perceived all sorts of deep spiritual interpretations, all of which have been chewed on a great deal by both modern scholars and modern Aussetru folk. But at the same time, it's something you could put on and have even the little kids in the audience laughing at. In others, you get high drama. You get bloodshed, you get chases, you get all sorts of things, and these ritual dramas would have done a lot of things on a social level. The people know the stories, and not only know them, but feel that they've experienced them, because one thing that we see even in the Middle Ages, even in the Renaissance later on, is that pre-modern people did not have quite the same distancing mechanism of, oh, it's just a play, that 20th century people have. There are descriptions from the late Middle Ages of, recreations of battle being staged at feast, and the nobles getting overexcited and leaping in to join. In the mystery plays of 15th century or so, villagers would do the mystery play, this scene from the Bible, and they would have to come out on stage afterwards, remove their mask from the audience, and say, "See, I am John the carpenter, your neighbor. See, I am Mary the washerwoman, your neighbor." They had to very, very clearly and specifically redistinguish themselves for their roles, because while the ritual drama, the mystery play, or its predecessor was going on, to the people watching, it was real. It was really happening. And in the among the Norse, I think that it is extremely likely that what a Norse person watching one of these ritual dramas would experience, they would feel that they were there, that it was really happening right there. If something went ghastly wrong in the middle of it, it went wrong throughout the worlds. It was important that things worked out, even though you already knew the story. It was crucial that things worked out, and it was crucial that the story be redone, that it be retold, because every year, you need Gerther to finally give in to Freyr, so the earth can be fruitful. Every year you need Skadi to accept the Weregild, marry Njörður, go down to the sea, and then go back to the mountains in the course of time. Every year you need the blessings of the gods, which are made manifest through these dramas.
Which suggests that repetition is an important part of ritual.
Yes. If you look at any culture, you will see that. C.S. Lewis, writing about whatever church he was involved with, I think he was an Episcopalian or something.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, but he talked, one of the things he talked about in the purely social sense is that people like constancy, people like change. So the liturgy is the same every year, but it changes through the year. The church dressings are the same every year at the same time, more or less, but they change through the year. So you have this sense of progression, but you also have the sense of not only the familiar, but I don't much like using terms like eternal in the concept of the Norse, but certainly,
Cyclical?
I think the spiral of the year, I think you see each year comes back to the same place, but things have changed. Hopefully things have gone upwards. But you see this constant cyclical process happening in everything. You look at the gods realm and you see it happening in the long term. What's expected to happen after Ragnarok bears a considerable resemblance to what happened in the early days with the death of Ymir, after the death of Ymir and the creation of the worlds. It all comes around, and having the seasonal rituals the seasonal dramas which bring everything on into the Middlegarth and make it real, that was important, and of course, again, to get back to the question of, well, how does this relate to modern day practice? I'm not saying that, every kindred needs to get together 3 times a year or 12 times a year or whatever and put on a big massive play. There are plenty of heathens out there who have been practicing quite happily to the delight of the gods for decades and never had anything to do with a ritual drama. But it is one thing that is worth doing, is always very cool to do, and I'm terribly fond of it myself. And it's something to keep in mind even when constructing, if your group or you are among the people that like keeping it short, simple, and friendly. It's just one more possibility of an element you could add a little bit in. Maybe wear a mask, maybe have a brief dialogue. But the central elements of ritual, as it's practiced today, which were more or less kind of sort of distilled from the saga accounts back in the early 70s, are passing the horn, which I will get to again very, very shortly, calling the gods, pouring a holy liquid, usually alcoholic, although other liquids were considered holy as well if you're not for alcohol. Milk, very, very holy liquid, water drawn from a stream at sunrise in particular, any number of things. But anyway, you pass the horn and you pour liquid into the bowl and you go around sprinkling everyone, and then you pour it out upon the earth at the place of your choice. A lot of people have holy trees or stones that they use, just as our forebears did. Some people have made their own harrows of heaped stones. There's a wide range of options. When our forebears were traveling or suffering social oppression or for whatever reason, did not have an actual hope, it was very common to have small images of your deity that you could carry in your belt pouch or purse or whatever you had on you, and you could communicate with them and make offerings to them that way. So you didn't really need a big setup. But always it's that sense of togetherness, of sharing food or drink, which again goes back consistently to the Stone Age, and of physically giving some portion of it, pouring it out on the land, into the water, wherever is fitting, depending on the deity and you and your family traditions and where you are, and all of that sort of thing. Now, I think it is fairly accurate to say that this is kind of, in any way you slice it, whatever else you do around it, this sharing with each other and the gods is the most essential center of Germanic ritual. Having said that, one thing that did evolve was invented in the 70s, possibly as a result of many people having gone to bardic circles at conventions. I don't know where the idea came from in that sense. There is this modern practice of passing a single horn around the circle from person to person. Now, our ancestors almost certainly didn't do that. Why do I think our ancestors didn't do that? Firstly, by the Viking Age, we were looking at pretty good-sized gatherings, and it has been experimentally proven that if you've got more than 30 to 40 people at your ritual, and each freaking one of them has to make a toast, you're going to be there a long time. If you're a king in his hall and you've got several, possibly, 200 or more people, you could be there all night and everyone would have gotten bored and gone off to pee or have a shag in the corners or get drunk somewhere else. Or any number of things that they could have been doing while the horn was going around, boring everyone out of their minds, because no matter how inspired people's toasts are, no matter how spiritual they are, if you have to stand there listening to 120 people each do an individual thing, unless you have a whole lot more focus than I do, you're going to be real bored and sore in the legs by the end of it. Also, it's unhygienic. It is. It's just asking for diseases. And it's totally non-historical. What in the Viking Age, if you invited a Viking to one of these things, a Viking Age Scandinavian, that person would have been appalled to see that you were so freaking poor that people couldn't afford their own horns to drink out of. You had your own horn, and if you were best buds with someone, or if you were courting them or married to them, you would share the horn with that person. You would not share the horn with everyone who just showed up in the hall. You might not even like all of them. Drinking 2 by 2 was a very personal thing, a very intimate thing. Really, it would be far more appropriate if one insists on having the individual toasts, which they weren't doing at the big gatherings, as near as we can tell, at least as much as story tells us, assuming he had a clue, which he may or may not have. The king or whoever was in charge of things, the spiritually and or secularly large and in charge person, they would get up and they would make the major toasts and everyone would drink to them. And then they went back to having, a feast, and the animal that had been offered, that would have obviously happened earlier, because it takes a while to cook up a whole animal. If you do the offer, if you offer your pig at sunset, you better have it into the barbecue pit pretty fast, if you want it for noon the next day. But anyway, so you would have the person in charge making the major toasts. Everyone would drink to them, and then you would sit there sharing out the results of the critter that you killed yesterday as part of this ongoing celebration feast, and you would be there, and you would all be sharing this with the gods, and everyone would presumably be happy, unless you had, unless your king was some nuts who had picked up a funny religion in foreign parts and was reluctant to do his share, as in the saga of Haakon the Good. But aside from little glitches like Haakon's temporary conversion, it worked out very well.
At this point, I noticed that we've actually gone over an hour, which has been really exciting because this has been really interesting. I'm wondering if you wanted to keep going on this, or do you want to maybe do a part 2 where we do go through some actual rituals for different holidays and different things like that?
It's probably worth a part 2.
Yeah.
There's a lot of material here that we have not yet explored.
Yeah, and I think this has been a great kind of overview background, and I can call this sort of, part 1 background, and then we can do maybe the next time. We've done some practicality, but do a bit more practicality next time. Well, I want to thank you a whole lot for being here. Is there anything else you'd like to mention before we leave?
Well, as we all know, Winter Nights is coming up. I trust everyone has had a good and fulfilling harvest season. And I would urge everyone to gather or find some grain to make a last sheaf with, to hang out for Sleipnir as he passes by on the winds of the furious host, which is soon to be riding.
Great. Well, on that note, I think I'm going to say goodnight at this point. And I'll look forward to seeing everyone again here at Cat's Eye on the Future. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.